We're very excited to have Eric White, who is a research social scientist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station with the USDA Forest Service. And he will be telling us about the data, showing us the data and information from our area and how tourism is affecting our area. We are going to have him take over the slideshow. So Eric, would you like to come on board?
Sure, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for joining us.
No problem. I'll let you end your slideshow and then I'll share mine. Fantastic. Thank you all for being here this morning and welcome. As Emily mentioned, I'm a scientist with the U.S. Forest Service. I work for the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service. And a fair part of my research is trying to understand how people recreate, the patterns in their recreation, trends over time, and what all of that means for the individual visitors themselves who are recreating and for the communities around the places where that recreation is happening. Today I'm going to talk about current trends in recreation use both nationally and in the Columbia River Gorge here. I'm going to talk about what we think might happen in the coming decades in the West Coast around recreation participation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what increased recreation and tourism can mean for visitors themselves and for the communities around these recreation places. I'll note at the outset that I'm not going to talk a whole lot about 2020 and COVID-induced recreation changes, but I'm happy to talk about that later on if there are questions. Thought we'd start today in the Columbia River Gorge. And we all know that's a wonderful place and a very special place and an incredibly popular place. The University of Portland did a study there in 2019, and one of the outcomes from their study was that they estimated there were about 1 million visits to Multnomah Falls. So if you spread that across the year, that's around 3,000 plus visits a day. In the months of July and August, when they were doing their study, that amounted to about 8,000 visitors each day at Multnomah Falls. And to put that 1 million visits into perspective, there are about 114 national forests across the United States. And when you think about national forests, think about big places like Mount Hood National Forest or Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, really big places. Of the 114, 56% of them received less than 1 million visits. So this one site here in the Columbia River Gorge has more visits than well over half of the national forests in the United States. If we zoom out a little bit from Multnomah Falls and think about the historic Columbia River Highway, and again, we're on the west end here, thinking about the Forest Service sites. In 2016, we estimated that there are about 2 million visits to the Forest Service sites that are shown on the map here, kind of around Multnomah Falls. And that includes the million at Multnomah Falls, so an additional million beyond that. And one thing I want to highlight is that hiking and viewing nature really account for the vast majority of the primary reason people are visiting these places. Those are their primary activities. And I'm going to talk about hiking a few times today. So I just want you to think about that. We can't really think about recreation in the Columbia River Gorge without putting it in the context of what's happening nationally and within our region. And if we look at the patterns in recreation participation, these are number of participants in this be a set of 6 outdoor recreation activities across the country. And over the last decade or so, we've seen sort of steady, gradual increase in recreation participation in these activities, with the exception of a jump there in hiking kind of in the last few years and a bit of a decline in camping prior to 2018. We've seen pretty steady trends, slightly upward. It's important to note that these trends are really driven by population increase. There's more participants in these things because population is greater. It isn't necessarily that a larger share of the population in the United States is engaging in these activities. There's more of us. We go from national and kind of zoom in here to Oregon and Washington. Those of you who live here and those of you who enjoy this place know that we are people who are really, we feel strongly about recreation. We love to be outdoors and in nature. And in both states, residents, about 95% of the population says that they participate in at least one outdoor recreation activity each year. And that may not be a nature-based recreation activity, but at least they're outdoors doing something. If we think more nature-based items, about 75% of residents say that they go walking on local trails or paths around their home. And then if we go out a little further, about half of the residents in our two states say that they go on day hikes on trails at some distance from their home. And to put that 50% in perspective, nationally across the country, about 15% of people in the country say that they go day hiking. So in Oregon and Washington, it is 50%. So dramatically larger than what we see elsewhere in the US. I mentioned that nationally, our participation rates are really driven by population change. And if we look at populations in Oregon and Washington over the last decade, we can see some fairly consistent increases over the period. The population in Washington has grown a little more rapidly than the population in Oregon, but they're both trending slightly upwards. It's important to note that this increase is primarily driven by people moving into our two states rather than natural increase, which would be births over deaths. So we have population increase. We have two states where a lot of people really enjoy recreating and it's important to them. What's the other piece of the puzzle? And another piece of the puzzle is tourism. And these are folks that are traveling from other states within the US or other countries around the globe, or traveling just long distances in general. And this particular graph is from Dean Runyon and Associates and Travel Oregon. And what it shows is the spending in the Columbia River Gorge from 1992 all the way on the left side of that graph to 2019 all the way on the right side of that graph. And this is a fairly astounding figure to me. It shows that the expenditures in the Gorge here by tourists have tripled over that time period. And that's one of the real positives, as Emily mentioned, that there can be a tremendous amount of economic spending in a location that is popular for tourism. But it also, if you look behind those dollars, are people. And so certainly that means a lot of people coming here into the Gorge over that same time period. Just a couple points of interest on this graph. If you look in 2002, 2003, you can see a little downturn in tourism post-2001. And then if you look in 2009, 2010, you can see a little downturn in tourism post-Great Recession. But if we look from 2013 up to about 2019, kind of on the right side of the graph, you see pretty consistent trend upward over time, and particularly over here the last